A millionaire found a beggar who looked exactly like him asking for money, and 2 hours later something unexpected happened. The roar of the limousine's engine faded softly as Richard Thompson, the most influential business magnate in New York City, impatiently waited for the traffic light to change to green. His fingers drummed on the leather steering wheel, his mind already on the next board meeting. At 55 years old, Richard was the very image of success. Impeccable suit, perfectly groomed salt and pepper hair, and a penetrating gaze that had closed countless million-dollar deals. The tapping on the window abruptly pulled him from his thoughts. With a sigh of annoyance, Richard lowered the tinted glass, ready to dismiss the beggar du jour with a few coins, but the words froze in his throat. In front of him, with an outstretched hand and a weary look, was a face he hadn't seen in over 50 years, a face that was the exact reflection of his own, marked by time and hardship, but unmistakable. Robert. The word escaped his lips as an incredulous whisper. The beggar blinked, confused. How do you know my name?" Richard felt the world come to a standstill. Memories flooded his mind. Two identical boys playing in the backyard of a modest house in the outskirts of New York City shared laughter, dreams of conquering the world together. And then, the accident. The train. The screams. The crushing certainty that his twin brother, his other half, was gone forever. "Robert, it's me. Richard, your brother." The revelation fell like lightning between the two men. Robert took a step back, his eyes scanning the luxurious car, the expensive suit, and finally fixing on Richard's face. Understanding hit him hard, and his legs threatened to give way. "Richard, but I thought you had died in that accident all these years." The honk of a car behind the limousine broke the moment. The traffic light had changed to green, but Richard was paralyzed, unable to take his eyes off his long-lost brother. With a sudden movement, he opened the passenger door. "Get in," he ordered, his voice trembling slightly. "We have a lot to talk about." Robert hesitated for a second, but something in Richard's gaze, a mix of shock and longing, convinced him. With awkward movements, he climbed into the luxurious vehicle, closing the door behind him. The limousine pulled away from the traffic light, leaving behind a line of annoyed cars and confused drivers. Inside, the silence was heavy, laden with unanswered questions and emotions held back for decades. Richard drove aimlessly, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. How was it possible that Robert was alive? What had happened after the accident? Why had he never tried to contact the family? And above all, how had they ended up with such diametrically opposed lives? Robert, for his part, observed with amazement the interior of the limousine, a world so far removed from the streets that had been his home for years. His calloused hands, stained by years of hard work and survival, contrasted sharply with the soft leather of the seats. Finally, Richard broke the silence. "We thought you had died in that train accident, Mum and Dad. They never fully recovered." Robert closed his eyes, the pain evident on his face. I woke up in a hospital. I couldn't remember anything. My name, my family, everything had been erased. They told me I had been found wandering near the tracks, injured and confused." Richard gripped the steering wheel tightly. "And after that? What happened to you all these years?" "I survived," Robert replied simply. "The streets became my home. I learned to get by, to defend myself, and over time to help others who were in my same situation." The contrast between their lives couldn't be more stark. Richard, the business magnate, owner of an empire built with determination and sometimes with questionable decisions. Robert, the silent leader of New York City's forgotten, a man who had found purpose in adversity. "We need to talk," said Richard, making a sudden decision. "There's so much to explain, so much to catch up on. Let's go to my house." Robert nodded silently, overwhelmed by the emotions and memories that were beginning to surface. As the limousine headed towards the most exclusive neighborhood in New York City, the Thompson brothers prepared to face a past they thought was lost and a future they never imagined. They would share what neither of them knew was that, at that very moment miles away, a third man was looking at an old photograph of two identical boys smiling at the camera. Alexander Rodriguez, the third Thompson brother, sketched a cold smile as he traced a plan that would change everyone's fate. The unexpected reunion at that traffic light was not just the beginning of a long-postponed family reunion, it was the first move in a game of power, ambition, and redemption that would shake the foundations of New York City and test the deepest bonds of blood and heart. Richard Thompson's mansion stood imposingly in the heart of the Upper East Side, a testament in marble and glass to the success he had forged over the years. For Robert, crossing the threshold of that house was like entering a completely alien world, a cruel reminder of how different their lives had been. Richard guided his brother to a spacious study where a bottle of aged whiskey and 2 crystal glasses awaited them. The silence between them was heavy, laden with unasked questions and contained emotions. "Please sit down," said Richard, pointing to a leather armchair. Robert obeyed, uncomfortable, his worn clothes contrasting sharply with the luxury surrounding him. Richard poured 2 generous measures of whiskey and handed a glass to Robert. "To the reunion," he toasted, his trembling voice betraying the apparent calm of his face. Robert nodded and took a sip, the burn of the alcohol awakening distant memories of a shared childhood. How did you get to all this, Richard?" he finally asked, making a gesture that encompassed the opulence surrounding them. Richard sighed, sinking into his own armchair. "After the accident, after losing you, I promised myself I would do everything possible to ensure our parents never suffered again. I started with small businesses, import and export. I worked day and night, sacrificed relationships, friendships, all to build something that would protect us from the uncertainty that had taken you away from us." Robert listened in silence, his mind struggling to reconcile the boy he remembered with the powerful man in front of him. "The empire grew," Richard continued. "I diversified, invested in technology, real estate, finance. Each success was a victory against the fate that had separated you from us. But every night when I came home, I felt the emptiness of your absence." "And you, Robert, what happened to you after the accident?" Robert took another sip of whiskey, grateful for the warmth spreading through his body. "As I told you, I woke up with no memory. I found myself alone, without identity, in a world that didn't forgive weakness. The streets of New York City became my home and my school." His gaze was lost in the distance, reliving years of struggles and discoveries. "I learned to survive, but I also discovered that there were others like me, forgotten people. Marginalized over time, I became a kind of leader for them. We organized protests, created support networks. We didn't have much, but we had each other." Richard listened, fascinated and horrified in equal parts. The idea of his twin brother living on the streets, fighting day by day to survive, was like a stab in the heart. "Robert, I'm so sorry. If we had searched more." Robert raised a hand, stopping his brother's apologies. "The past is the past, Richard. We can't change it. The question is, what do we do now?" Before Richard could answer, the study door burst open. An elegant woman, in her 50s, entered with a determined step. "Richard, where have you been? The board of directors is furious. You've missed the most important meeting of—" Her voice trailed off as she saw Robert. Her eyes widened, moving from one brother to the other in disbelief. "Sarah, honey," said Richard, standing up. "I'd like you to meet Robert. My brother, Sarah Thompson, Richard's wife and vice president of the company, stood frozen. But Robert is dead, the accident." "It's a long story," Richard interrupted. "A story we need to share with the whole family." At that moment, Richard's phone rang insistently. Seeing the number on the screen, he frowned. "Excuse me, I have to take this call." Richard went out to the balcony, leaving Robert and Sarah in an uncomfortable silence. Meanwhile, on the phone line, a deep and threatening voice resonated in Richard's ear. "Mr. Thompson, I hope you're prepared for the storm that's coming. Your empire is about to crumble, and you don't even imagine where the blow will come from." Richard gripped the phone tightly. "Who are you? What do you want?" A cold laugh was the only response before the call was cut off. Richard stood looking at the city sprawling before him, a sense of dread settling in his chest. The reunion with Robert, which should have been a moment of joy, was now overshadowed by an unknown threat. Inside the study, Robert observed Sarah with curiosity. So you're my brother's wife? Sarah nodded, regaining her composure. And his business partner, Robert. I can't imagine what you've been through, but you must understand that the sudden appearance of a lost brother, well, it's complicated. Complicated, repeated Robert, a note of bitterness in his voice. I suppose you're referring to the legal and financial implications of my existence. Sarah had the decency to look ashamed. I didn't mean for it to sound like that. It's just that I'm an inconvenience to the empire you've built, Robert completed. Don't worry, I'm not here to claim anything. My life is on the streets with the people who need me. Richard returned at that moment, his face pale and tense. We need to talk, he said, looking at Sarah. Something's happening in the company, and I have a feeling this is just the beginning. Robert stood up, suddenly feeling out of place. Maybe I should go. You have important matters to attend to. No, Richard said firmly, putting a hand on his brother's shoulder. I just found you, Robert. I'm not going to lose you again. Besides, I have a feeling I'm going to need your help. The three looked at each other, each aware that their lives had just changed irrevocably. Outside, the sun was beginning to set over New York City, tinting the sky blood red. It was the prelude to a storm that was about to break over the Thompson family, a storm that would test the bonds of blood, love, and loyalty. What none of them knew was that at that very moment, Alexander Rodriguez was sitting in his luxurious office, smiling as he reviewed documents that could destroy Richard's empire. The third Thompson brother, raised in opulence but consumed by resentment, was ready to make his move. The game had begun, and the board was the entire city of New York: Richard, the magnate, Robert, the leader of the forgotten, and Alexander, the vengeful shadow. Three brothers, a shared past, and an uncertain future. The unexpected reunion was just the beginning of a story that would shake the foundations of their lives and of American society. The morning after the reunion dawned grey over New York City, as if the city itself sensed the storm that was approaching. In the Thompson mansion, Richard prepared to face the board of directors, his mind divided between the joy of reuniting with Robert and the mysterious threat hanging over his empire. Robert, for his part, woke up disoriented in the guest room. The luxury surrounding him contrasted brutally with the life he had led for decades. He dressed in the clothes Richard had lent him, feeling like an imposter in his own skin. In the dining room, the brothers met Sarah, who greeted them with a tense smile. "Good morning," she said, serving coffee. "Richard, the board meeting is scheduled for 10. We need a strategy." Richard nodded, his face a mask of determination. "Robert," he said, turning to his brother, "I know this is sudden, but I'd like you to come with me to the office. There's something I want to show you." Robert hesitated. "I don't know if it's a good idea, Richard. I don't belong in that world." "Please," Richard insisted. "You're my brother. A part of you will always belong to my world, just as a part of me will always belong to yours." Moved by Richard's words, Robert finally agreed. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Alexander Rodriguez was preparing to deliver the first blow in his elaborate plan for revenge. At the central offices of Thompson Industries, a glass and steel skyscraper that dominated the New York City skyline, Richard and Robert were greeted by curious looks and surprised whispers. The resemblance between the brothers was impossible to ignore, and rumors began to spread like wildfire. Richard guided Robert to his office on the top floor, a spacious room with panoramic views of the city. "I want to show you something," he said, heading to a safe hidden behind a painting. From the safe, Richard extracted an old photo album and a yellowed document. "This is all I have left of our childhood," he explained, opening the album. "And this is our birth certificate. We're triplets, Robert." Robert felt the ground move beneath his feet. "Triplets? But how?" "Alexander," Richard murmured, pointing to a photo where three identical boys smiled at. "The camera, our third brother. He disappeared the same night as the accident. We never knew what became of him." Before Robert could process this new information, the office door burst open. Sarah entered, her face pale. "Richard, you need to see this." She turned on the office TV, tuning to a news channel on the screen. A man with a familiar face to the Thompson brothers was giving a press conference. "My name is Alexander Rodriguez," the man announced, his voice firm and determined. "Although perhaps I should say Alexander Thompson, I am the lost brother of Richard Thompson, the CEO of Thompson Industries, and I'm here to claim what rightfully belongs to me." Richard and Robert watched, stunned, as Alexander detailed a story of abandonment and betrayal, accusing Richard of deliberately leaving him behind to keep the entire family empire for himself. "This is a disaster," Sarah muttered. "The board of directors is in panic. Shareholders are demanding answers." Richard collapsed into his chair, overwhelmed. "I don't understand. How is this possible? We thought he had died in the accident, just like Robert. Robert, who had remained silent until that moment, stepped forward. "Richard, I need you to tell me everything, every detail of that night, of what happened afterwards. If we're going to face this, we need the whole truth." Richard nodded, his face a mix of determination and fear. "You're right, but first we have to deal with the board of directors. Robert, I know it's asking a lot, but would you accompany me? Your presence might help calm the waters." Robert hesitated for a moment, aware that he was about to immerse himself in a world he had always rejected, but looking into his brother's eyes, he saw something he hadn't seen in decades: family. "I'm with you, brother," he finally said. As Richard and Robert prepared to face the board of directors, Alexander watched the broadcast of his own press conference from a luxurious penthouse. By his side, a figure in the shadows smiled with satisfaction. "Phase 1 completed," said Alexander, raising a glass of champagne. "Soon everything Richard built will be ours." The figure in the shadows nodded. "Remember, our deal, Alexander. I help you destroy Richard and you give me control of operations in the south." Alexander smiled, a cold and calculating smile. "Of course, my dear partner. After all, business is business." The woman stepped out of the shadows, revealing a beautiful and cunning face. It was Emily Foster, Richard's ex-fiancée, and now one of the most ruthless businesswomen in America. "Let the game begin," she said, clinking her glass with Alexander's back at the offices of Thompson Industries. Richard and Robert were preparing to enter the boardroom. Before opening the door, Richard paused and looked at his brother. "Whatever happens in there, Robert, I want you to know one thing. I'm happy to have found you, and together we'll face whatever comes." Robert nodded, feeling a mix of nervousness and determination. "Together," he repeated. The door opened, and the Thompson brothers entered to face their destiny, not knowing that each step brought them closer to a truth that would change their lives forever. The boardroom of Thompson Industries was a silent battlefield when Richard and Robert entered. The board members, men and women in impeccable suits and sharp gazes, observed the identical brothers with a mixture of amazement and suspicion. Richard took his place at the head of the table, Robert standing by his side, an uncomfortable but firm presence. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, his voice calm despite the inner storm, "I know you have questions. I'm here to answer them." For the next hour, Richard narrated the story of the accident, the supposed death of his brothers, and the recent discovery that both were alive. Robert observed in silence, amazed by his brother's ability to handle pressure. "And what about Alexander's accusations?" asked one of the directors, his voice laden with skepticism. "He says you deliberately abandoned him." Richard shook his head. "That's completely false. We believed that both Robert and Alexander had died in that accident. I would never have abandoned my brothers." "And how can we be sure?" insisted another director. "This situation could destroy our shareholders' trust." It was then that Robert stepped forward. "If I may," he said, his voice hoarse from disuse in formal situations, "I can assure you that my brother is telling the truth. I myself have just discovered that I have a family, a history. Richard is not the man Alexander describes." The room fell silent, weighing the words of this man who until recently had been living on the streets. There was an authenticity in Robert that was hard to ignore. Finally, Sarah spoke up. "I propose we form a crisis management team. We need to control the narrative and protect the company's image while we resolve this family situation." The board agreed to Sarah's proposal, and Richard felt a small relief. At least they had gained some time. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Alexander and Emily were celebrating the chaos they had unleashed. Did you see their faces? Alexander laughed, pouring himself another glass of champagne. Richard must be desperate. Emily smiled, but her eyes remained cold and calculating. Don't get overconfident, Alexander. Richard hasn't gotten where he is by being a fool. He'll have a plan. That's why I have you, darling, Alexander replied, moving closer to her. Your inside knowledge of the company is our secret weapon. Emily subtly moved away. Remember, this is a business agreement. Don't get confused. Alexander nodded, a shadow of disappointment crossing his face. Of course. Business me. Back at the Thompson mansion, Richard, Robert and Sarah gathered to plan their next move. We need to know more about Alexander, said Richard, pacing the study. Where he's been all these years, who's been supporting him? Robert, who had remained thoughtful, spoke up. I can help with that. On the streets we have our own information networks, people who see and hear things others ignore. Richard looked at his brother with a mixture of surprise and admiration. You'd do that for me? For us? Robert nodded. We're family, Richard. Besides, I have a feeling there's more at stake here than just your company. Sarah, who had been reviewing documents, looked up. Richard, there's something else you should know. I've been investigating some suspicious transactions in the company. I think someone has been leaking information. A mole? Asked Richard, frowning. It's possible, Sarah replied. And if so, it could be connected to Alexander. Richard collapsed into his armchair, the weight of the situation falling on his shoulders. We're under attack from all fronts. It was then that Robert had an idea. Richard, do you trust me? With my life, Richard responded without hesitation. Then I have a plan, said Robert, a spark of determination in his eyes. But it's going to require us to step out of our comfort zone, both of us. As Robert explained his plan, a mixture of hope and apprehension settled in Richard's heart. It was risky, no doubt, but it could be their best chance. Let's do it, Richard finally said. That night, as the city slept, two figures quietly left the Thompson mansion. Richard, dressed in simple, worn clothes, followed Robert towards the poorest neighborhoods of New York City. It was time for the magnate to see the world through his brother's eyes. What neither of them knew was that their movements were being observed. In the shadows, a solitary figure took photos, a smile of triumph on their face. Alexander's plan was about to take an unexpected turn. Meanwhile, in an elegant downtown bar, Emily Foster met with a nervous-looking man. "Do you have what I asked for?" she asked, her voice soft but threatening. The man, who turned out to be one of the directors of Thompson Industries, nodded tremblingly as he handed her an envelope. "This will destroy Richard," he muttered, "but if he finds out it was me..." Emily smiled, taking the envelope. "Don't worry, dear, your secret is safe with me." As the night progressed, the fates of the Thompson brothers became increasingly intertwined, weaving a web of secrets, betrayals, and redemptions that would shake the foundations of New York City. The truth was out there, waiting to be discovered, but the path to it would be full of dangers and surprises. On the city streets, Richard was about to discover a world he had always ignored, a world that Robert knew all too well. And in that world, the rules of the game were very different from those of boardrooms and glass skyscrapers. The night was young, and the adventure had only just begun. The streets of New York City took on a different life. At night, Richard, accustomed to seeing the city from the comfort of his limousine or the heights of his penthouse, found himself immersed in a world that had always existed parallel to his own, but which he had never truly noticed. Robert guided his brother through narrow alleys and hidden squares, greeting with familiarity figures that emerged from the shadows. Men and women of all ages, with faces marked by hard lives, looked curiously at the twins. "Welcome to my world, brother," said Robert as they stopped in a small square surrounded by decrepit buildings. A group of people had gathered around an improvised fire, sharing a pot of stew. Richard watched, fascinated and moved. "Robert, how have you lived like this all these years?" Robert smiled, a smile that mixed pride and sadness. "It hasn't been easy, but here I've found a community Richard people who take care of each other, who share the little they have. They approached the group around the fire. An older woman with a wrinkled face but kind eyes stood up to greet them. "Robert, my dear," she said, hugging him. "Who's your friend?" "Mrs. Johnson," Robert replied affectionately. "This is my brother, Richard." A murmur of surprise ran through the group. Everyone there knew Robert's story, the leader without a past who had united and protected them for years. Sit down," Mrs. Johnson insisted. "The stew is hot and there's enough for everyone." Richard soon found himself with a steaming bowl in his hands, surrounded by curious but welcoming faces. As he ate, he listened to these people's stories. Former laid-off workers, immigrants in search of a better life, young people who had fled abusive homes. Each story was a blow to his conscience, a reminder of the inequality that existed in the city he helped run from his glass towers. "Robert," said a young man no more than 20 years old, "is it true what they're saying, that your brother is the owner of Thompson Industries?" Robert looked at Richard, leaving him the decision of how to respond. Richard took a deep breath. "Yes, it's true, I'm Richard Thompson." The silence that followed was tense. Some looked at Richard with suspicion, others with curiosity. "And what's the great Richard Thompson doing in our humble corner?" asked a woman, her tone challenging. Richard felt the weight of all the gazes on him. "I'm here to learn," he finally said, "to see the city through my brother's eyes, and maybe find a way to do things differently." Robert put a hand on his brother's shoulder. "Richard is facing his own challenges. There are forces that want to destroy what he's built, and we need your help." Gradually, Richard began to explain the situation with Alexander, the threat hanging over the company, and how it could affect thousands of workers and their families. "Why should we help you?" asked the young man from before. "Your company has closed factories, left people on the street." Richard lowered his head, ashamed. "You're right, I've made mistakes, made decisions, thinking only about the numbers and not about the people. But I want to change, that if I manage to maintain control of the company, I promise things will be different." Mrs. Johnson, who had been listening in silence, spoke. "Robert has been our protector for years. If he trusts you, we will too. What do you need?" Robert smiled, grateful. "We need information, eyes and ears all over the city. Alexander must be getting support from somewhere, and we need to know from whom and how." The group nodded, understanding the task. Soon, they organized into small teams, each with an area of the city to watch. As the night progressed, Richard and Robert moved away from the group a bit. "Thank you," Richard said quietly, "for showing me all this I've missed so much, locked in my world of business." Robert nodded. "It's never too late to open your eyes, brother. But remember, these people are risking a lot to help us. Don't let them down." Suddenly, a young man came, running out of breath. "Robert, Richard, you have to see this." He showed them his phone. On the screen, a breaking news headline glowed ominously: "Scandal at Thompson Industries. CEOs seen in marginal neighborhoods, shady dealings." Accompanying the headline was a blurry but recognizable photo of Richard and Robert entering the square. "Damn," Richard muttered. "We've been followed." Robert frowned. "This is Alexander's work. He's moving his pieces faster than we thought." Richard took out his own phone, which he had been ignoring all night. Dozens of missed calls and messages from Sarah and the public relations team. "We have to go back," he said. "This is going to be a media hell." As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Johnson approached. "Remember your promise, Richard Thompson," she said, her voice soft but firm. "These streets don't forget." Richard nodded solemnly. "I won't forget. You have my word." As the brothers walked away, watched by the concerned gazes of the community they had just met, they didn't notice a figure slipping between the shadows, following their every move. In his luxurious penthouse, Alexander smiled as he watched the news. "Perfect," he murmured. "The great Richard Thompson mingling with the scum of the city. This will destroy his reputation." Emily, sitting beside him, didn't seem so convinced. "Don't underestimate him. Alexander Richard is cunning. He could turn this to his advantage." Alexander turned to her, his eyes shining, with a mixture of amusement and threat. That's why I have you, darling. Your next move will be crucial. Are you ready? Emily nodded, though a shadow of doubt crossed her face for an instant. I'm always ready. As night gave way to dawn, the Thompson brothers prepared to face a new media storm. But something had changed in Richard. The night on the streets had opened his eyes to a reality he could no longer ignore. On the horizon, the sun began to peek over New York City, illuminating both the skyscrapers and the marginal neighborhoods. It was the beginning of a new day, and with it the start of a battle that would define not only the future of Thompson Industries, but also the heart and soul of the city itself. The morning arrived with the fury of a media storm. Richard and Robert had barely set foot in the Thompson mansion when they were assaulted by a frantic Sarah and a public relations team in full crisis mode. "What were you thinking?" Sarah demanded, waving a newspaper in front of Richard. The headline screamed, "The King of Business and the King of the Streets, the Thompson brothers together in the slums." Richard, exhausted but with a new determination in his eyes, took the newspaper. "I was thinking about seeing the truth for the first time in decades, Sarah." Robert observed the scene in silence, uncomfortable in the luxury of the mansion after the night on the streets. He felt like he was in two worlds at once, divided between the life he knew and the one he could have had. "We need a press conference," declared one of the advisors. "Control the narrative before Alexander distorts it even more." Richard nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He turned to Robert. "I need you to be there with me, brother. It's time for the world to know the whole truth." Robert hesitated. "Richard, I don't know if I'm ready for that. My world, my people." "Your people are the reason we need to do this," Richard interrupted. "It's time for Thompson Industries to take responsibility and do things differently." While the public relations team frantically prepared for the press conference in another part of the city, Alexander received an unexpected visit. Emily entered his penthouse unannounced, her face a mask of concern. "We have a problem," she said, without preamble. Alexander, who was enjoying his breakfast while watching the news, raised an eyebrow. "What could be a problem? Richard is finished." Emily shook her head. "You don't understand. I've been investigating, Alexander. The story you told me about how Richard abandoned you, it doesn't add up." Alexander visibly tensed. "What do you mean?" "I found records, Alexander, from the orphanage where you grew up. You were adopted by the Rodriguezes weeks after the accident. Richard and his parents searched for you for years." Alexander's face contorted into a mask of fury. "You're lying. My adoptive parents told me." "Your adoptive parents lied," Emily interrupted. "I don't know why, but they did. And now our entire plan is at risk." Alexander stood up abruptly, his breakfast forgotten. "It doesn't matter. We have enough to destroy Richard, his reputation, his company." "And then what?" Emily asked. "Have you thought about what will happen afterwards? Thousands of jobs at risk, families that depend on Thompson Industries." For a moment, Alexander seemed to hesitate, but then the hardness returned to his eyes. "It's too late to back down. We'll proceed as planned." Emily looked at him for a long moment. "Very well," she finally said, "but remember, Alexander, every action has consequences." Meanwhile, at the Thompson mansion, Richard and Robert were preparing for the press conference. Richard, dressed in his usual impeccable suit, looked at his brother, who had insisted on wearing his own worn clothes. "Are you sure about this?" Richard asked. Robert nodded. "If we're going to tell the truth, it has to be the whole truth, no masks, no pretenses." When the Thompson brothers stepped out to the podium, facing a horde of journalists and cameras, the contrast between them couldn't be more evident. And yet there was a unity, a shared strength that was palpable. Richard cleared his throat and began, "Good morning, I'm here today, not only as CEO of Thompson Industries, but as a brother, as a son, and as a man who has made mistakes and is willing to correct them." He proceeded to tell the complete story. The accident, the loss of his brothers, the years of fruitless searching, and finally, the unexpected reunion. "For years," he continued, his voice laden with emotion, "I built an empire thinking it was the only way to honor the memory of my lost brothers. But in the process, I lost sight of what really matters. people, the community, the responsibility we have to those less fortunate. Robert stepped forward. "My name is Robert Thompson," he said, his voice hoarse but firm. "For decades, I lived on the streets of this city with no memory of my past, but I found a new family among those society has forgotten, and now with my brother by my side, we are committed to doing things differently." The camera flashes became frantic. Journalists shouted questions, but Richard raised a hand to silence them. "From today," he announced, "Thompson Industries commits to a new business model, one that prioritizes the well-being of our employees and the communities in which we operate. We will implement affordable housing programs, job training, and support for small entrepreneurs in the most needy neighborhoods." Robert smiled, proud of his brother, but his smile faded when he saw a familiar figure among the crowd of journalists. "Richard," he murmured, "look, there in the front row was Alexander, his face a mask of fury and confusion. Beside him, Emily watched the scene with a mixture of admiration and calculation. Richard saw his third brother, and on impulse did the unthinkable. "Alexander," he said into the microphone, "I know you're there, and I know you have questions, accusations, maybe even hatred towards me, but you're our brother. And this family has been separated for too long. I invite you here and now to join us, to hear the truth and be part of something bigger than ourselves." The silence that followed was deafening. Alexander, caught by surprise, seemed to be struggling with himself. Emily whispered, something in his ear, but he ignored her. Slowly, as if each step were a battle, Alexander began to move towards the podium. The camera flashes became frantic, capturing the moment when the three Thompson brothers met face to face for the first time in over 50 years. The fate of Thompson Industries, and perhaps all of New York City, hung by a thread. The truth was about to come to light, and with it, the possibility of redemption or an even deeper fall. At that moment, with the city and the world watching, the Thompson brothers faced not only their past, but the future they could forge together. The silence in the press room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Alexander stopped a few steps from the podium, his eyes scanning the faces of Richard and Robert, searching for answers to questions he didn't even know he had. Richard extended a hand towards his lost brother. "Alexander," he said softly, his voice amplified by the microphone, "I know there's a lot to explain, a lot to resolve, but here, now, in front of everyone, I want you to know that we never stopped looking for you." Alexander hesitated, his emotions at war. The rage and resentment he had, nurtured for years, fought against the longing for family that he had never managed to completely suppress. Robert, sensing the tension, stepped forward. "Brother," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion, "the three of us have suffered, each in our own way, but now we have the opportunity to heal together." It was that moment of vulnerability, that show of humanity, that finally broke Alexander's facade. With a choked sob, he climbed onto the podium and, to the astonishment of everyone present, embraced his brothers. The camera flashes became frantic, capturing the moment when the three Thompson brothers reunited after more than 5 decades of separation. Among the crowd, Emily watched the scene with a mixture of emotions. Her plan for revenge against Richard was crumbling before her eyes, but something deeper, more human, began to stir within her. Sarah, who had been observing from the side, quickly took control of the situation. "Ladies and gentlemen of the press," she announced, "the Thompson family thanks you for your presence. We will be issuing an official statement in the coming hours. For now, we ask for respect and privacy for this family moment." As security guards began to escort the journalists out of the room, the Thompson brothers retreated to a private room, followed closely by Sarah. Once alone, the weight of the situation fell upon them. Alexander was the first to speak, his voice trembling. "All this time I believed you had abandoned me. My adoptive parents told me that no one had looked for me, that my biological family didn't want me." Richard shook his head, tears in his eyes. "Alexander, we searched for you for years. We hired private investigators, put ads in the newspapers. Mom and Dad never lost hope." Robert, who had remained silent, finally spoke. It seems we were all victims of the lies and secrets of others. Sarah, always practical, intervened. Gentlemen, I know you have a lot to talk about, but we have a crisis to manage, Alexander. Your public accusations against Richard and the company. Alexander lowered his head, ashamed. I'm sorry I was so blinded by resentment, so sure I had been betrayed. Richard put a hand on his brother's shoulder. The past is the past. What's important is how we move forward from here. At that moment, Alexander's phone rang. It was Emily. With an apologetic look to his brothers, Alexander answered the call. "What the hell are you doing?" Emily's voice sounded furious. "The whole plan, everything we've worked for." Alexander closed his eyes, making a decision. "It's over, Emily. I can't continue with this. The truth." "The truth?" Emily interrupted, her voice cold as ice. "You think you know the whole truth, Alexander. There are things you still don't know, things that could destroy your precious reunited family." Alexander felt a chill run down his spine. "What are you talking about?" "Come see me," Emily said, alone, "and I'll show you what really happened the night of the accident." The call cut off, leaving Alexander pale and shaking. "Is everything okay?" Richard asked, concerned about the change in his brother's demeanor. Alexander hesitated for a moment, but then decided it was time for total honesty. "There's something you should know," he said. "I haven't been acting alone in my campaign against the company. I have a partner, Emily Foster." Richard visibly tensed upon hearing that name. "Emily?" "But she was your ex-fiancée, I know," Alexander completed. "She found me a few months ago, told me her version of the story, of how you had betrayed and abandoned her for the company." Robert, who had been listening attentively, intervened. "And what does she want now?" Alexander looked at his brothers, doubt clear in his eyes. "She says she has information about the night of the accident, information that could change everything." A heavy silence fell over the room. Richard and Robert exchanged glances, years of unspoken secrets and pain passing between them. Finally, Richard spoke. "We'll go together," he said firmly. "Whatever the truth is, we'll face it as a family." Sarah, who had been observing the interaction, stepped forward. "This could be a trap," she warned. "Emily is dangerous, and she has a lot to lose if the truth comes out." Robert nodded, his street experience making him cautious. "Sarah's right, we need to be careful." Alexander looked at his brothers, a mixture of gratitude and determination in his eyes. "Thank you," he said softly, "for trusting me despite everything I've done." Richard smiled, a tired but genuine smile. "We're family, Alexander. That means something." As the Thompson brothers prepared to face whatever Emily had in store for them, in another part of the city, the woman in question stared fixedly at an old yellowed envelope. Inside, documents and photographs that had remained hidden for decades threatened to come to light. Emily took a sip of her wine, her mind a whirlwind of emotions and calculations. The truth she was about to reveal would not only change the fate of the Thompson brothers, but her own as well. "Let the final game begin," she murmured to herself, as the afternoon sun bathed New York City in golden tones, oblivious to the drama that was about to unfold in its streets. The sunset painted the New York City sky in reddish and golden hues when the Thompson brothers' limousine pulled up in front of an elegant building in the Upper East Side. Richard, Robert, and Alexander descended, their faces a mixture of determination and apprehension. "Are you sure about this?" Richard asked Alexander. As they entered the lobby, Alexander nodded. "We have to know the truth, whatever it may be." The elevator took them to the penthouse, where Emily was waiting for them. When the door opened, they saw her standing by the window, her silhouette outlined against the urban landscape. She turned slowly, a cold smile on her lips. "Well, well," she said, her voice soft but laden with sarcasm. "The happily reunited. Family, how touching." Richard stepped forward. "Emily, whatever you think you know, whatever your plan is, it's over. We're here for the truth, nothing more." Emily laughed, a joyless sound. "The truth? Oh, Richard, always so noble. Are you sure you can handle the truth?" Robert, who had been observing in silence, intervened. "Ma'am, we've lived with lies and secrets for too long. Whatever it is, we're prepared." Emily looked at them one by one, pausing on Alexander. "And you, my dear partner, Are you ready for your world to crumble once again? Alexander swallowed hard but nodded. Do what you have to do, Emily. With a theatrical movement, Emily pulled out a yellowed envelope from a nearby drawer. Here it is, gentlemen, the truth about the night of the accident, about why you were separated, about the great secret of the Thompson family. With trembling hands, Richard took the envelope and opened it. Inside were old photographs, official documents, and a handwritten letter. As the brothers crowded to see the contents, their faces went from curiosity to shock and then to horror. This can't be true," Richard murmured, his voice barely a whisper. Robert took one of the photographs, his eyes wide with disbelief. "But if this is true, it means that—" Alexander completed the sentence, his voice broken with emotion, "that our parents were responsible for the accident." Emily watched with a mixture of satisfaction and something deeper, almost like remorse. "Oh, it's true. Your dear father, in a desperate attempt to save the family business from bankruptcy, orchestrated the train accident. The idea was to collect the life insurance of one of you, but things got out of control." Richard collapsed into a nearby armchair, overwhelmed. How did you obtain this information?" Emily smiled sadly. "Your father confessed everything to me on his deathbed, Richard. It was his last act of cowardice, passing on to me the burden of this secret." Robert, always the most pragmatic, looked at Emily with suspicion. "And why reveal it now? What do you gain from this?" "Justice," Emily replied simply, "or revenge. Sometimes it's hard to distinguish between the two." Alexander, who had remained silent, processing the information, finally spoke. "All this time I blamed Richard, the family, when in reality, we were all victims," Richard completed, his voice laden with pain and resignation. The silence that followed was heavy, laden with unspoken emotions and altered realities. The Thompson brothers looked at each other, now united not only by blood, but by a shared past of betrayal and loss. Emily watched them, an indescribable emotion in her eyes. "And now what, gentlemen? What will you do with this truth?" Richard slowly stood up, his face a mask of determination. "What we should have done 50 years ago, face it together." Robert nodded, putting a hand on his brother's shoulder. As a family, Alexander, after a moment of doubt, joined them. No more secrets, no more lies. Emily watched them, a mixture of admiration and envy on her face. "Well, it seems I underestimated the power of family ties." Richard turned to her. "Emily, I understand your pain, your desire for justice, but this truth doesn't just affect us. Thousands of employees, their families, depend on Thompson Industries. If this comes to light—" Emily smiled. But this time the smile didn't reach her eyes. "Ah, Richard, always thinking of the greater good. What makes you think you have a choice?" At that moment, the sound of sirens filled the air. Police lights illuminated the windows of the penthouse. Robert tensed, years of street instinct putting him on alert. "What have you done?" Emily shrugged with feigned innocence. "Let's say I may have leaked certain information to the authorities. After all, a crime is a crime, no matter how much time has passed." The Thompson brothers looked at each other, the realization hitting them like a sledgehammer. Their reunion, their newly discovered family unity, was about to be put to the test in the most brutal way possible. As the sirens approached and police lights bathed the room in blue and red flashes, the three brothers found themselves at a crossroads. The truth they had sought for so long now threatened to destroy everything they had built. Richard, always the leader, made a decision at that moment. "Whatever happens," he said, looking at his brothers, "we'll face it together as it should have been from the beginning." Robert and Alexander nodded, a new determination shining in their eyes. Emily, observing the scene, felt a pang of something she couldn't identify. Remorse, longing. Whatever it was too late to turn back now. The sound of footsteps approaching down the hallway announced the imminent arrival of the police. The Thompson brothers prepared to face their fate, united at last, after decades of separation and lies. The penthouse door burst open, and the fate of the Thompson family, of Thompson Industries, and perhaps of all of New York City, was about to change forever. The days that followed the revelation in Emily's penthouse were a whirlwind of interrogations, sensationalist headlines, and rampant speculation. The Thompson brothers, united for the first time in decades, found themselves in the eye of a media and legal storm that threatened to destroy everything they knew. The New York County Courthouse became the stage for a drama that captured the attention of the entire nation. Richard, Robert, and Alexander, dressed in somber suits, walked together through the marble hallways, flanked by an army of lawyers and pursued by a cloud of journalists hungry for the latest scoop. "Mr. Thompson, is it true that your father orchestrated the accident?" shouted one reporter. "How will this affect Thompson Industries?" asked another. "Do you plan to turn yourselves in to the authorities?" insisted a third. Richard, accustomed to dealing with the press, maintained his composure. "No comment for now. We trust in the judicial system and will fully cooperate with the investigation." Robert, less used to the spotlight, stayed close to his brothers, his presence silent. But firm Alexander, for his part, seemed to be struggling internally. The guilt for his role in exposing the family secret clearly visible on his face. In the courtroom, Judge Martinez, a stern-looking man with decades of experience, presided over the case. The prosecution, represented by the ambitious district attorney Valerie Ortiz, presented their case with fervor. "Your Honor," Ortiz began, her voice resonating in the room, "what we have here is a crime that has gone unpunished for over 50 years. An act of criminal negligence that not only cost innocent lives, but separated a family and built a business empire on foundations of deception and tragedy." The defense attorney, the renowned Dr. Johnson, counterattacked with equal passion. "The prosecution conveniently forgets that the true perpetrators of this alleged crime are no longer among us to face justice. My clients, the Thompson brothers, were children at the time of the accident, victims, not perpetrators. As the trial progressed, witnesses came and went, former employees of the railroad company, investigators who had worked on the original case, even Emily Foster, whose testimony was as dramatic as it was revealing. "Yes, it's true," Emily declared from the stand, her voice trembling slightly. "Richard Thompson Sr. confessed everything to me on his deathbed. The guilt was consuming him, and he believed that by sharing the truth with me, he would somehow redeem himself." The audience in the courtroom collectively gasped. Richard closed his eyes, the weight of his father's actions falling heavily on his shoulders. Robert squeezed his brother's hand in support, while Alexander stared straight ahead, his face a mask of contained emotions. Outside the courthouse, the city of New York seemed divided. Protesters gathered daily, some demanding justice and the dismantling of Thompson Industries, others defending the company's legacy and the jobs it provided to thousands of families. In the streets where Robert had lived for decades, people gathered in vigils praying for the man who had protected and guided them for so long. In the hallways of Thompson Industries, nervous employees whispered about their future, fearing that the empire would crumble and take their jobs with it. As the trial neared its conclusion, the time came for the Thompson brothers to testify. Richard was the first to take the stand. "Mr. Thompson," District Attorney Ortiz began, "when did you learn of the true circumstances of the accident that separated your family?" Richard took a deep breath before responding. "I found out the same night as my brothers, when Emily Foster revealed the truth to us. Until that moment, I genuinely believed it had been a tragic accident." "And how did you feel when you discovered that the empire you had built was based on a lie?" Ortiz pressed. Richard looked directly at his brothers before answering. "I felt horror, shame, a deep sadness, but I also felt determination. Determination to make things right, to use the company's resources to repair as much as possible the damage caused." When it was Robert's turn, his testimony moved the room. He spoke of his years on the streets, of the community he had formed, and how, despite not remembering his past, he had always felt a void that was only filled when he reunited with his brothers. "I don't seek revenge," Robert declared with a firm voice. "I seek justice, yes, but also redemption, not for myself but for all those who have been forgotten by society." Alexander was the last to testify. His voice trembled at first, but gained strength as he spoke. I spent years blaming Richard, my biological family, for abandoning me. I allowed that anger to consume me and lead me to make decisions I'm not proud of. But now I see that we were all victims of circumstances that were beyond our control. At the end of his testimony, Alexander looked directly at the judge. I don't ask for clemency for myself, Your Honor. I accept any punishment the court deems appropriate for my actions, but I beg you to consider the greater good. Thompson Industries, under Richard's leadership, has the potential to do much good, to repair the damage caused. When Judge Martinez retired to deliberate, the tension in the room was palpable. The Thompson brothers, seated together, awaited their fate. Richard took the hands of Robert and Alexander. "Whatever happens," he said, quietly, "we'll face what comes as a family." Robert nodded solemnly. "Together." Alexander, with tears in his eyes, squeezed his brother's hands. "Together." As the sun set over New York City, bathing the city in golden and reddish hues, the fate of the Thompson brothers, of Thompson Industries, and of thousands of lives connected to them hung by a thread. Judge Martinez's decision would not only determine the future of a family and a company, but would also set a precedent for how society deals with the sins of the past and the possibility of redemption. In the streets, in offices, in homes, across the city, people waited with bated breath. Judge Martinez's verdict would not only be a judgment on the Thompsons, but a judgment on time itself and its capacity to heal, punish, or redeem. The New York County Courthouse was in sepulchral silence when Judge Martinez returned to the room. The Thompson brothers, seated together in the front row, straightened up, their faces a mixture of anxiety and resolution. "In the case of the people versus Thompson Industries and the Thompson brothers," the judge began, his voice resonating in the room, "this court has reached a decision." The world seemed to hold its breath as the judge continued. "The crimes committed more than 50 years ago are serious and cannot be ignored. However, this court also recognizes that the true perpetrators are no longer among us to face justice." Richard closed his eyes, preparing for the worst. Robert squeezed his brother's hand, while Alexander stared straight ahead, his face a mask of contained emotions. "Therefore," Judge Martinez continued, "it is the decision of this court that Thompson Industries, under the direction of the Thompson brothers, shall establish a compensation fund for the victims of the accident and their families. Additionally, the company will undergo a court-supervised restructuring with the aim of ensuring ethical and transparent practices in all its operations." A murmur ran through the room. The judge raised a hand to request silence before continuing. "As for the Thompson brothers, this court recognizes that they were children at the time of the accident and therefore cannot be held guilty of their father's crimes. However, their recent actions cannot be ignored." The judge addressed Alexander directly. "Alexander Thompson, for your participation in the defamation campaign against your brother and the company, you are ordered to perform 1,000 hours of community service." Alexander nodded, accepting the sentence with a mixture of relief and determination. "Richard Thompson," the judge continued, "although you are not found guilty of any crime, you are ordered to work closely with charitable and community organizations to ensure that Thompson Industries fulfills its social responsibility." Richard nodded solemnly, already planning in his mind how to implement these changes. "And Robert Thompson," said the judge, his voice softening slightly, "this court recognizes your years of work with the less fortunate in our city. You are entrusted with the task of overseeing Thompson Industries' community outreach programs, ensuring that the company never loses sight of its impact on the lives of ordinary citizens." Robert, surprised but moved, accepted the responsibility with a nod of his head. "It is the hope of this court," Judge Martinez concluded, "that this sentence will not only provide a measure of justice for the errors of the past, but also pave the way for a better future. Case closed." The bang of the gavel resonated in the room, sealing the fate of the Thompson brothers and Thompson Industries. Outside the courthouse, a crowd anxiously waited. When the brothers emerged, they were greeted with a mixture of cheers and boos. Richard, taking the initiative, approached the journalists' microphones. "We accept the court's decision with humility and determination," he declared. "Thompson Industries has been part of this city for generations, and it's time we fully assume our responsibility to the community. I promise that from today on, every decision we make, every project we undertake, will have as its main objective the well-being of the citizens of New York City." Robert stepped forward. "For years I saw firsthand the struggles of the less fortunate in our city. Now, with the resources of Thompson Industries, we have the opportunity to make a real difference. We will not waste this opportunity." Alexander, the last to speak, did so with a trembling but firm voice. "I have made mistakes, driven by resentment and anger, but my brothers have taught me the power of forgiveness and family unity. I will dedicate every hour of my community service, and every day after that, to repairing the damage I have caused and building a better future for our city." As the Thompson brothers walked away from the courthouse, surrounded by a ring of security, the city of New York seemed to be at a turning point. News of the sentence spread quickly, generating heated debates in cafes, offices, and homes. In the days and weeks that followed, Thompson Industries began its transformation. Under Richard's direction, with Robert's advice on social issues and Alexander's renewed energy, the company began to implement significant changes. The compensation fund for the victims of the accident was quickly established, providing financial and emotional support to families who had suffered in silence for decades. Robert oversaw the creation of affordable housing programs and job training in the city's most needy neighborhoods. Alexander, fulfilling his community service, became a familiar face in soup kitchens and community centers. The transformation wasn't easy. There was resistance within the company, shareholders concerned about the costs of these new programs, and skeptics who doubted the sincerity of the changes. But little by little, the determination of the Thompson brothers began to bear fruit. 6 months after the trial, on a sunny spring afternoon, the three brothers met on the rooftop of Thompson Industries' main building. From there, they had a panoramic view of the city they had sworn to serve and improve. Richard, with a few more grey hairs but with a new light in his eyes, raised a glass to family, he said, and to second chances. Robert, dressed in a suit that still felt strange to him but which he wore with dignity, smiled, "To community, and to never forgetting where we come from." Alexander, with the humility and wisdom that only come from facing one's own mistakes, added, "To the future, and to the opportunity to do things right." As the sun set over New York City, bathing the city in golden tones, the Thompson brothers contemplated the horizon. The past, with all its secrets and pains, was behind them. The future, full of challenges but also of hope, stretched out before them. And at that moment, united by blood, ties strengthened by forgiveness and understanding, the three knew that whatever happened, they would face tomorrow together as a family. As it should have always been, a year had passed since the trial that shook the foundations of Thompson Industries and forever changed the destiny of the brothers. New York City, a city accustomed to ups and downs, watched with caution but growing optimism the transformation of one of its most emblematic companies. On a cool autumn morning, Richard Thompson found himself at the inauguration of the first phase of the affordable housing project in Brooklyn, one of the city's most needy neighborhoods. At his side, Robert oversaw the final details, his street experience proving invaluable in the planning and execution of the project. "I never thought I'd see something like this," Robert murmured, watching as excited families received the keys to their new homes. "I spent so many years fighting for crumbs, and now—" Richard put a hand on his brother's shoulder. "This is just the beginning, Robert. Your vision, your knowledge of people's true needs is what makes all this possible." As they cut the inaugural ribbon, a familiar figure approached from the crowd. It was Mrs. Johnson, the woman who had taken Robert in during his toughest years on the streets. "My boys," she said, hugging both brothers with tears in her eyes, "look at what you've accomplished. You're changing lives." Robert, moved, formally introduced Mrs. Johnson to Richard. "She was my family when I had no one else," he explained. "Without her, I wouldn't be here today." Richard, understanding the weight of those words, took Mrs. Johnson's hands. Thank you for taking care of my brother when I couldn't. You'll always have a special place in our family." In another part of the city, Alexander Thompson was completing his last hours of community service at a rehabilitation center for addicts. What had begun as an obligation had become a passion. Alexander discovered that helping others overcome their demons was helping him face his own. "Remember," he said to a group of young people in recovery, "every day is an opportunity to rewrite our story." Believe me, I know from experience. After the session, Alexander received a call from Richard. "How's everything going, brother?" Richard asked. "Better than I ever imagined." Alexander replied, "I think I've found my calling. I'm thinking of establishing a foundation to expand these rehabilitation programs." "You have our full support," Richard affirmed. "In fact, I have a proposal for you. How would you like to lead the new social responsibility division of Thompson Industries?" Alexander was speechless for a moment. "Richard, I don't know what to say. After everything I did." "The past is past, Alexander." Richard interrupted. "You've proven your worth and your commitment. It's time for you to come home to the company, but this time doing what truly passionate you." That night, the three brothers gathered for dinner at the Thompson mansion, something that had become a weekly tradition. Sarah, who had been instrumental in restructuring the company, joined them. "I have news," Richard announced once everyone was seated. "Thompson Industries shares have reached their highest point in years. Investors are impressed with our new direction and the results we're achieving." Robert raised his glass. "To doing good and doing it well," he toasted. Alexander, with a smile, added, "and to the family that never gives up." Sarah, observing the brothers, couldn't help but comment, "It's incredible how things have changed in such a short time. A year ago, we were on the brink of collapse, and now we're stronger than ever," Richard completed, taking his wife's hand as they dined and shared anecdotes from their respective projects. The doorbell rang. The housekeeper entered with an envelope in hand. "Mr. Richard, this just arrived for you." The messenger said it was urgent. Richard opened the envelope curiously, and his face paled as he read the contents. "It's from Emily," he said, his voice barely a whisper. The brothers exchanged concerned looks. Emily Foster, the woman who had triggered the entire crisis, had disappeared after the trial. No one knew her whereabouts. "What does it say?" Robert asked, tensing. Richard read the letter aloud. "Dear Thompson brothers, a year has passed since our paths crossed in the most dramatic way possible. I have been observing from the shadows, seeing how you have transformed not only your company, but your lives and the lives of many in New York City. I confess that when I revealed the truth about the accident, I was driven by rancor and a desire for revenge. I never imagined that so much light could be born from that darkness. I write to you not to seek forgiveness, but to offer you one last piece of the puzzle. Attached you will find documents that prove that your parents, in the last years of their lives, tried to amend their mistakes. They established secret trusts for charitable works and tirelessly sought their lost children. Perhaps this doesn't change the past, but I hope it gives you some peace. With respect and admiration, Emily Foster." The silence that followed the reading was heavy, laden with unspoken emotions. Richard put the letter on the table and took the attached documents, confirming what Emily had written. "After all," Alexander murmured, "our parents tried to do the right thing in the end." Robert, with tears in his eyes, added, "Perhaps remorse and redemption run in the family." Richard looked at his brothers, at Sarah, and then at the documents he held in his hand. "I think it's time to fully honor our family's legacy. Not just the business empire, but also this final desire to do good." The Thompson brothers looked at each other, a silent understanding passing between them. The past, with all its secrets and pains, finally seemed to be closing its circle. The future, though challenging, looked brighter than ever as night fell over New York City. In the Thompson mansion, a once fractured but now stronger than ever, family prepared to write the next chapter of their story. A chapter of hope, redemption, and the transformative power of family love.